There's a certain kind of person the camera can never fully capture, and Ian Roussel is one of them. For 9 years, MAVTV viewers watched him take rusted-out husks of steel and turn them into rolling sculpture, working entirely alone, entirely from instinct, in a desert workshop where the heat alone could break most people before lunch. Then, without warning, the show that made him a cult figure in the custom car world simply stopped airing. No farewell tour. No dramatic finale. He just wasn't there anymore. And that silence is exactly what makes people want to know what actually happened to him. To understand the weight of what came later, you have to understand who Ian Roussel was before any of it, because almost none of what made him remarkable had anything to do with television. Ian Roussel was born in Sunland, California in November of 1970, and if you'd met him as a teenager, you wouldn't have pegged him as a future television star. School wasn't where his mind lived. His mind lived in the garage, in the shapes of things, in the question of what a piece of scrap metal could become if somebody simply refused to see it as scrap. He didn't attend a trade school. He didn't apprentice under some legendary name in the custom car world. He just started building over and over until the work itself became loud enough that people had to notice it. By the time he was 22 years old, Roussel had already launched his own operation, eventually relocating out to the Mojave Desert, where land was cheap, space was endless, and nobody was around to tell him how a car was supposed to look. That distance mattered. Isolation wasn't a limitation for him. It was the whole method. He worked without blueprints. No CAD renderings, no design software, no sketch pinned to the wall for reference. He'd study a vehicle, let a shape take form somewhere in his head, and start cutting steel, trusting the process to reveal itself as he went. He was refreshingly blunt about what actually drove him. In one of the more candid interviews he's given, he put it plainly. He wasn't especially attached to cars themselves. What he was addicted to was the making, the act of pulling a shape out of nothing and watching it become real. That single distinction explains almost everything peculiar about his career. He wasn't chasing trends or trying to please a market. He was chasing form for its own sake. The atmosphere around his work matched the man. He's described himself, without any hesitation, as kind of a punk rock guy, and the soundtrack in his shop reflected it. Ministry's Jesus Built My Hot Rod has been known to blast through the space while he welds, a fitting anthem for someone who never bothered softening his edges for a mainstream audience. None of it would have been sustainable, though, without Jamie. His wife wasn't a background character in his story. She was the structure that let the whole enterprise function. While Ian buried himself in the physical act of building, Jamie ran the parts of the business that make building possible at all. Client relationships, logistics, and eventually a growing role in production and editing once cameras entered the picture. The partnership was never advertised as the centerpiece of a story, but it was the foundation underneath everything people eventually saw on screen. Full Custom Garage premiered on MAVTV Motorsports Network on March 28, 2014, and it landed in a television landscape that had trained audiences to expect a very specific formula. Countdown clocks, manufactured conflict, difficult clients, dramatic reveals timed for maximum tension. Ian Roussel offered none of that. He worked solo, without a crew hovering for reaction shots, without a script pretending that a deadline mattered more than the metal in front of him. When he made a mistake mid-build, it stayed in the episode. When he had to abandon an approach and rethink the whole thing on camera, viewers watched the actual moment of recalibration instead of a tidy cut to the solution. It shouldn't have worked by the conventional logic of reality television. Watching a man quietly reason through a fabrication problem isn't supposed to be compelling entertainment. But it was. Audiences didn't describe the show the way people usually describe reality TV, as background noise, as something to have on. They described studying it. Fans made pilgrimages out to the Mojave just to stand near the shop. People rewound sequences frame by frame to understand how a particular curve in the metal had been achieved. International collectors, buyers in Japan, Germany, the Netherlands, commissioned builds sight unseen, based purely on what they'd seen him do on screen, with finished vehicles shipped out of Long Beach to homes around the world. What the show never fully translated to the audience, though, was the physical cost of what they were watching. The Mojave Desert doesn't do air conditioning kindly. Summer temperatures out there regularly climb past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's before you factor in an open flame from a welding torch, a grinder throwing sparks, and a metal roof structure absorbing sunlight all day like an oven. Roussel was in that environment for punishing stretches, long physically demanding days year after year, while a television crew captured footage that always looked far more comfortable than it actually was to produce. The human body can adapt to heat for a while. It cannot do so indefinitely, and years of sustained exposure to that kind of environment take a toll that doesn't always show up right away. By his early 50s, after nearly a decade of this rhythm, something in the equation had to give. Here's the part of the story that most retellings get wrong. Ian Roussel wasn't canceled. He wasn't quietly dropped by a network that had moved on to the next trend. He made a decision, on his own timeline, to step away from television. And by the time the public actually noticed, he'd already been building his exit for well over a year. In January of 2023, Ian and Jamie quietly launched a YouTube channel called Full Custom Ian. There was no announcement that the television show was ending. No press release. It simply appeared, running in parallel with the final stretch of Full Custom Garage, which continued airing until its concluding episodes in early 2024. That overlap matters because it reframes the entire narrative. This wasn't a man scrambling to reinvent himself after losing a platform. This was a craftsman who had already built the next door before he needed to walk through it. The philosophy behind the YouTube channel was the deliberate opposite of everything that had worn on him during the television years. Episode lengths weren't dictated by a broadcast slot. They ran anywhere from under 20 minutes to well over an hour, however long a build actually demanded. Nothing was staged for artificial tension. If a cut went wrong, it stayed in the footage. If Ian had to stop, stare at a piece of metal, and rethink the entire approach, viewers got to sit in that uncertainty with him instead of having it edited into a seamless montage. Jamie stepped further into the production role she'd been building toward for years, producing, editing, shaping raw footage with the same directness Ian brought to a piece of sheet metal. The audience followed him without hesitation. Longtime fans who'd watched since 2014 described the channel as finally meeting the real version of the man television had only partially shown them. His Instagram presence, under the handle at @full_custom_Ian, grew into a substantial following, and he continued making public appearances at major industry events, signing posters and talking through builds, not as a celebrity cashing in on nostalgia, but as a craftsman showing people what he'd actually made. Then, in September of 2024, came a loss that had nothing to do with ratings or contracts. Ian and Jamie made the decision to permanently close their Desert Ranch shop, the roughly 2,600 square foot Mojave Desert workspace that had been their home base for years. This was the building where Full Custom Garage had actually been filmed, where somewhere in the neighborhood of 180 custom vehicles had been designed and built from scratch, each eventually finding its way into a private collection somewhere in the world. The shop wasn't struggling. It wasn't failing financially or falling out of relevance. By every external measure, it was still respected and still productive. But years of accumulated physical exhaustion, creative pressure, and sheer wear on the body had reached a point where staying in that same environment no longer made sense to either of them. When the closure was announced, the reaction from the community made clear how much that specific piece of ground had meant to people who'd never even set foot in it. Fans posted old photos from visits. Fellow builders talked about how watching Ian work in that space had shaped how they thought about their own craft. It wasn't sentimentality for its own sake. It was people recognizing that something genuinely significant was ending. There's a real distinction worth sitting with here. The Desert Ranch wasn't just a business address. It was the physical proof of a particular idea. That one person, working alone in a simple space with no crew and no shortcuts, could produce things of lasting value. That idea doesn't disappear when a building closes. But the specific place where thousands of hours had gone into proving it, that loss was real, and the people who mourned it weren't overreacting. So after the grind of 9 television seasons, the physical toll of a decade in extreme heat, and the closing of the workshop that had defined an era of his career, Where does Ian Roussel actually stand today? Still working, actively, and by most accounts more freely than he has been in years. The Full Custom Ian YouTube channel continues putting out substantial, long-form content from a new, smaller workshop, still in the Mojave, still built around the same uncompromising philosophy that made the television show unlike anything else in its genre. Viewers who followed the transition describe his on-camera presence as noticeably more relaxed, more willing to pause, stand back, and let a build breathe, without a broadcast clock pressuring every decision. There's a version of this story that frames all of it as pure tragedy. The heat, the exhaustion, the closed shop, the ended show. But that framing misses the actual shape of what happened. Ian Roussel wasn't pushed out of anything. He built his own exit on his own schedule, and he's still standing in a workshop right now, deciding what a piece of scrap metal is going to become next. Nobody, no network executive, no production calendar, no broadcast deadline, gets to tell him when to stop. When the history of custom car television eventually gets written properly, Roussel will occupy a strange and specific place in it. Proof that you could build 9 seasons of genuinely respected automotive television around one person working alone, with zero manufactured drama, and still end up with an international audience and collectors shipping his work overseas. That's not a footnote. That's an argument about what the genre could have been all along if it had trusted its subjects a little more and its formulas a little less. The 13-hour days in unforgiving heat were real. The closing of the desert ranch was a genuine, felt loss for a whole community of people who'd never even met him. But so is the fact that he's still out there right now, in a new shop, punk rock probably playing somewhere in the background, cutting metal into a shape nobody's seen yet, entirely on his own terms. If you want to actually understand why people made pilgrimages to stand outside a stranger's workshop in the middle of the desert, go watch a full build on Full Custom Ian. Don't skip ahead. Within the first 15 minutes, it makes sense. And if you've been following his work since 2014, drop your favorite build in the comments below. We read every one. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.